Our next decision-making bias is selective perception. And what this basically means is when we are in uncertain or ambiguous conditions, we are very much influenced by our lens and the way that we view the world, rather than the stimulus itself. It's so easy for us with our attitudes, our interests, our backgrounds, and experiences to layer our interpretation on something rather than taking the stimulus for what it is. It is very challenging for us to objectively see things around us, to see events and to see the world through different eyes. And so our goal is, part of it, what I'm doing with this class, with the ethical lens exercise and the simulation, is really teaching you to see the world through those different eyes. Really going back to the words of Joan Allaire, and how we need to really think about seeing the world and walking in someone else's shoes, stepping outside of the moral matrix, not being for or against, but just seeing the argument for the value of the argument. Does it make sense? You don't have to agree with it, but does it make logical sense based on what they value? And once you understand what someone's core issues and core values are, it makes it a lot easier to have a discussion about how you can find common ground in a solution. So selective perception is the thing that puts us in that us versus them mentality, that our way is right and everybody else's way is wrong, and therefore we're only going to engage in things that are consistent with our, our lens, and that's not always the right way to approach it. So the next bias is the confirmation bias, and I've already introduced it a little bit. With confirmation bias, what we're doing is giving weight to information that we already know or that we already believe to be true, and so as we find information that supports those views, we give an enormous amount of weight to them, but we ignore things that might be disconfirming. We ignore things that might say, no, this idea may not be so right, and we discount it and say, oh, it couldn't possibly be right, it's a bad study, it's bad this, it's bad that. We subjectively gather data. It's not objective. We'd like to believe it's objective. We may try to approach objectivity. But remember, we all have different lenses. We all weight things very differently in our heads and our minds, and we look at the world in our own unique way, so it is almost impossible for us to be strictly objective in the way that we gather our data. I remember having a student once, and we were talking about how he would make sure somebody followed the rules the way he wanted to have it set up to be able to do something. In his company, he says, well, I would just logically lay out the facts, and of course they'll understand. I'm like, but it's logical according to whom? Because it might feel logical to you, but it might not feel logical to the person sitting next to you. And the class was in agreement, and it took him a while to recognize that the idea that someone else might view his logical ideas as not so logical, was just a foreign idea to him. Eventually he got it, but it was sort of an interesting revelation for somebody who was very, very left-brained, logical, rational, everything fits in, into an orderly world. He was an engineer, and it was a very orderly world in which he liked to set up things, and he had to recognize that it was about his subjectivity. He was viewing this as logical and rational, but it was all based on the way he saw it, not the way it might be objectively viewed by others. So why do we engage in this confirmation bias? Well, mostly because we like consistency. We don't like things that are inconsistent. It drives us nuts. Now, that's not meaning that we are OCD and everything has to be orderly and what have you, but we want to see things happen consistently. We want to know if I do X, Y is going to happen. And so the consistency is something that we seek. So the confirming evidence just feeds into that need to have that consistency. And so when we get the confirming evidence, we go, see, I was right all along. And again, our goal with consistency is to get rid of the complexity or the things that might challenge, our worldview and our comfort zone. And here's the thing. Being in our comfort zone is never going to stretch us and push us to learn new things. When you find yourself going, oh, that's not the way I've done it before, or, that's not comfortable, that's the first clue that you need to push through it. You don't want to sit, in that discomfort anymore. It's really important that you figure out, how do I get out of this discomfort of having things that are really complex and really unpredictable, and allow myself to just be with that and not have it bother me that I can't create the order that I want. Sometimes complex issues are complex, and there's no way we're going to be able to manage all the moving parts to come up with the solution to the problem. So, we engage in that confirmation bias because it's our natural way for us to make things more predictable. But, when we're feeling our need to make sure it's consistent and neat and orderly, and we want only things that are, consistent with our belief systems, that's the first clue that we need to recognize that there's going to be some discomfort. Let it go. The discomfort's a natural part of learning from our failures and learning from our experiences. And every moment that we sit in that discomfort is just another data point for us to learn new things. Whether or not we're consciously doing it, our brain is always unconsciously processing this stuff. Framing biases are interesting because we tend to frame things in a way that makes the most sense to us. Just like a photographer frames a photo because they want your eye to fall on the bug on the flower or the clouds in the background, it's framed in a way because that's how you want people to interpret the message. We do this all the time when we're trying to influence someone. We narrow their focus in on the things that we think are the most important to try to have them ignore the man behind the curtain, kind of like that whole Wizard of Oz things, just focus on, the spewing, character in the front with the flames coming out of their nose and the smoke rising up. Don't look at me behind the curtain. So we want to frame, so we want people to believe things the way we want them to believe it. We see this all the time in advertising and in our appeals and the way that we influence people. And this is not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing, particularly if the intention is that we want people to stay healthy, or we want people to not engage in bad behaviors, right? We want to frame things in a way so they really get the underlying message, which is don't do this, or please do this. This is what we need. So, some of the things that we need to think about when it comes to framing is that perceived losses are treated very differently than perceived gains. This is a lot of the Kahneman and Tversky stuff about risk, right? When we have an outcome that we don't want to lose, okay, we want to hold on to this outcome as much as possible. We're incredibly risk-taking because we'll do whatever it takes to avoid the loss. We don't want to lose. On the other hand, you're in the situation where you may have a outcome that we want to keep the gain. We want to gain something. So in order for us to gain something and not lose it, we act more in a way that is more risk averse. So the outcome is something that we want. We're not going to risk anything to lose that opportunity to gain that thing. But when the outcome is something we could potentially lose, we are going to be as risk-taking as possible in order to achieve it. So in essence, if your probability is that you might lose it, is much higher than you're going to gain it, you're going to be very risk-taking. But if the probability is more that you're going to gain something, then we are much more risk-averse in that situation. And that was an interesting, the risk relationship is something that people recognize, and it applies in investments and things like that, where people they're willing to do whatever it takes to make the buck, but they don't want to lose it. So, when there's an opportunity to once you have it, you don't want to lose it. So therefore, you act very conservatively in order to retain it. But, when your chances are so slim and you have the potential loss, you definitely are going to engage in the risk in order to get that investment the way you want it. So there are many different ways that framing bias enters into our decision-making frameworks. One is risky choice framing and how we frame risky choices. I mean, because we don't want to risk loss, we work really hard to make sure, whatever it takes, that we're not going to lose something. On the other hand,
we want to hold on to what we've gained. We don't want any possibility or probability of losing what we've already gained. So those risky choice things, very different. So in here is a great example of the risky choice. The government is preparing to combat a rare disease expected to take 600 lives. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed, each of which scientists believe will have a certain consequence. A will save 200 people if adopted. B has a 1/3 chance of saving all 600, but a 2/3 chance of saving no one. And in this situation, we want to maximize. We want to win. We want to save that 600 people, and we're willing to take the risk in order to be able to save all those people. C, and we could change that. C would allow 400 people to die if adopted, and D has a 1/3 chance no one would die and a 2/3 chance all would die. In this case, we're going to be very conservative. We're going to change our approach to these sorts of things. But we can talk more in class and see if people agree or disagree with that framing. But I think, the bottom line is when there's a possibility that we could save more, we're much more likely, to engage in that risky behavior. So, way of thinking about it. Attribute framing, right? We can say something is 75% lean, but it still means it's 25% fat. So, people kind of get caught up in this idea of, oh, it's this, it's that, it's this. And we forget to think about it in the counterfactual way, right? It's like, if it's 75% lean, it's 25% fat. So do I still want 25% fat? So we frame it in a way to make it more appealing, but in fact it maybe is not so appealing. If you think about it, something has 25% fat in it. Maybe someone doesn't want that in their diet at all. The last way that framing comes into play is goal framing. For example, as I was saying before, sometimes we frame things in a certain way because we want them to focus on the most important factor, which is, regardless of all sorts of other things, if you do breast exams, you're going to increase the likelihood of finding a tumor early and getting treated, quickly. So they're framing it in a way that says the affirmative. Do this so that you can absolutely find the tumor and then you can get it treated right away. So there's an affirmative argument here. And then you can also do a negative argument. Those don't work as much because I don't know how many of you remember the commercial, and it was a long, long time ago, but it was, they showed an egg and said, this is your brain, and then they cracked it and they put it in a skillet that was already, very hot, and it said, and this is your brain on drugs, any questions? It was a huge scare tactic, and it really wasn't that successful in dissuading people from doing drugs. If you had an intention to do drugs, it didn't matter, because that was never going to happen to you anyway. Your brain wouldn't fry like that. And of course, we know that's ridiculous, and of course it does, but nonetheless, you can see sometimes the scare campaigns don't always work as well. So, but again, the framing, the way you frame it around the goal is, if you don't do it, you're going to decrease your chances. And people are less likely to respond to that. They want to know that if I do something, I'm going to gain something, not if I don't do it, I'm going to lose something. So the positive framing tends to work a lot better. Our next bias, the availability bias, has some overlap a little bit with confirmation bias. Basically what availability bias argues is that we make decisions based on the information that's readily available to us because, again, we're sorting through all this information, and many times we may be picking things that seem very consistent with our worldview. So since we use the things that are available to us, we tend to ignore the reality of situations. And a good example of this is, we hear of car accidents and airplane accidents, and certainly, there's always, a crash of some sort in the news in the last few years between the Malaysia Air, a couple of Malaysia airplanes, airplane that just crashed in Germany, and where we get this irrational fear of flying, when in reality the chances of us dying in a slip and fall in our bathtub or driving our car to work is a greater likelihood of dying in that accident than we are in an airplane. The chances of it happening are slim, but because it is such a big event, it is scary, and we feel out of control. That irrationality starts to kick in, because we say, oh, you know, when a car accident happens, a person dies, maybe 2, maybe 3. But when a plane crashes, it's hundreds, several hundreds sometimes, depending on, you know, the kind of flight it is. Overseas flights tend to be more. So it's very interesting to see how we tend to respond to stuff, even when it's irrational to think of it that way. The thing with availability bias, too, is it says we're the product of our experiences. You know, things that we see, things that we read, things that we then retain in our heads. We assume that our experiences, or the things that we've read, or that, you know, is balanced. That, you know, we have, you know, both sides of the arguments in our head, all readily available all the time, and our experiences and the things that we reach out to, because we engage a lot of times in confirmation bias, is not balanced. So we will distort all sorts of things. We don't even realistically look at the risks or the probabilities of something occurring, because all we can think of is, gosh, if I'm in an airplane, you know, 200 of us will die. And that really sticks with us. That's that one incident of having no control and dying in a plane accident is really different than, oh, I can control because I'm the driver, you know, when you're in the car. Experience trumps stats in our mind. So even if the statistics tells you it's not a probable outcome, because we may have experienced it ourselves, or, you know, or it's something that we have that's readily available to us in terms of, you know, this really pronounced, profound experience. You know, we're going to rely on our experience and our gut feel in an unhealthy way, in an inappropriate way, because we're allowing emotion to trump sort of, you know, this, you know, it becomes overwhelming. Overwhelmingly too important. You know, emotion's great, but too much emotion is a problem, and not enough emotion is a problem. We need to have some degree of emotion to tap into what's appropriate or what's not appropriate, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not sitting back and going, well, only my experience matters, regardless of all this data in front of me. Availability bias happens when we spend too much time focusing on our emotion, and then, you know, we have problems, you know, if we don't tap enough into our emotions. So it can go both ways. And, you know, there's no easy answer to how to get rid of these biases, because the bottom line is, you know, a little bit too much in one direction or a little bit not enough in another direction, and we run into problems with our ability to make interpretations of what's in front of us.